Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. After a previous week that featured a no-name surprise storm and a hurricane to be that formed over Georgia, the past week was one of appraising what went right and what went wrong. And we'll do the same tonight, including the mayor's and the governor's performances and the media coverage. The sun was in the news this week as an Orleans Parish Council Committee approved a solar plant, and so was the moon, as an anniversary reminds us of a New Orleans connection to one of the astronauts. These stories and the return of Ubix pies are on the menu for tonight's Informed Sources. Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Mark Schlefstein, environmental reporter, The Times-Picayune, The New Orleans Advocate. Jessica Williams, reporter, The Times-Picayune, The New Orleans Advocate. And Dave Cohen, news director, WWL Radio. And we're going to go to Dave first because first there came Wednesday and a whole lot of rain, which wasn't really officially Barry, because Barry wasn't official really at that point. What happened there?
Well, we were watching these two systems that were moving across the center of the United States. And the models all said that they were going to continue to come south and they were going to get into the Gulf and would then merge and form tropical characteristics. So we knew we had the possibility at that point that we would see a tropical storm or at least a tropical depression forming in the Gulf. Well, one of the two pieces, those low pressure systems that were coming across toward the Gulf, had this massive rotation around it. And a cell spinning around that rotation just happened to set up right over Lake Pontchartrain. And it missed Slidell. And as it came over Lake Pontchartrain, it blossomed. And it just kept sending cell after cell after cell right over the city of New Orleans. And before you know it, in less than 3 hours, we had 8 inches of rain at several locations.
And we had flooded streets, too.
Did we have flooded streets?
And so, you know, of course, the pumps, were they working?
Well, I think everybody who understands how the drainage system works will agree that no drainage system in the world would be able to handle 8 inches of rain in 3 hours. That's kind of accepted and understood. But the question is, did it perform as well as it could have? And did it do everything it could to help reduce the impact of all of that rain? Initially, and we've seen this time and time again, no matter who the mayor is, no matter who's running the Sewerage and Water Board, as soon as we have one of these massive flood events, the word is always, everything was working. Everything was in place. It was just Mother Nature, more than we could handle. So they came out and they said, yes, 118 out of 120 pumps were operational Wednesday at the time of the flooding. And
they could be operational. That didn't mean they were all working. Is that right?
Yeah. They're not constantly running, but they were all ready to work. Mm-hmm. They said they were manned, they were powered, and they were ready to go. 2 of them were offline for maintenance. And that's at any given time, I mean, they have to do maintenance. Problem is, we always hear that right after an event. Then, as the hours and days and weeks pass, we start to find out as we see the logs, as we get further reports. Now we find out that at one of the main pump stations on Broad, that a lightning strike knocked out 2 of the pumps for at least 45 minutes, and that a third pump failed when they tried to bring it on when the 2 failed. So of the 4 there, only 1 was operational at that time, which none of those were the 2 that were down for maintenance. But then we find out a similar thing happened in the 9th Ward. A lightning strike, they say, knocked out pumps at that location. So as time passes, we start to find out 118 out of 120 pumps were not operational, or something intervened to keep them from operating properly. And those things are obviously going to happen. You have an ancient system. You have a system that is being held together as best it can over, you know, it's past its expected life, you know, usefulness.
And you can't control lightning regardless if lightning strikes during a storm.
Well, of course not.
It knocks out power to any pump. I mean,
nonetheless, you just always wonder, why don't they come out and say, we're still trying to figure out how many pumps were working, how many went down, what the problem was. And even if it didn't make a major difference that these pumps that went down because of the lightning strikes or voltage issues went down, even if it didn't make a major difference, it makes a difference in the final analysis. Yeah, it was too much rain for any pumping system to handle, but could they have gotten the water out faster? Could they have prevented it from spreading as far and getting into as many homes? Those are the questions we're still trying to get answered.
And because there was flooding all over the city, in some areas, some neighborhoods, I know some friends of mine live in certain areas uptown, never had seen flooding before. They had it.
Well, that's the way unfortunately, that's the way thunderstorms work, especially when 8 inches of rain
Right.
fall within 3 hours. Wherever it's going to fall is going to be overwhelmed. There's no question about that. One of the things that we need to be looking at is what this storm can tell us about the future. And I see 2 different things. The first one is what we're actually seeing already, which is that we are seeing more intense rainfall events occurring more frequently. Okay, and the timing of when we get our 60 inches of rain a year occurs during small little bits now instead of spread out over the year. That's number one. The other thing is that people need to start looking at, okay, well, gee, wow, look at this, my house flooded this time, or I have water up to X spot on my yard. Well, you need to be responsible for that. You need to start looking at what can I do to figure out how to elevate my home, how to fill my yard with more dirt to make sure that the water doesn't get in, those sorts of things.
Make
and
sure
we
the
have to
catch
take
basins are cleaned
responsibility
out
for it.
too.
Well, that's
take
another
responsibility
issue.
for that.
The catch basins, we know that the city 2 years ago started this massive catch
Right.
basin cleaning program. Well, now that's over and there's not money to do it again. And so you clean the catch basins once, but they keep getting filled with, we know we have a litter problem. We know that we have drainage problems, and so they're going to keep getting filled with
Mardi Gras
junk.
beads.
Mardi Gras Beach, right? A lot of Mardi Gras.
Well,
beads.
I see one of the good things is that we do have a new director for the Sewage and Water Board who actually has a pretty good track record in his understanding of how decent systems work. So having him in charge now provides the opportunity for people to step back and start taking a look at what's going on. And they're about to begin a process of doing a long-term master plan for the Sewage and Water Board, a real review of what needs to be done. And hopefully these things that they're talking about, especially, like, gee, how do we deal with, like you said, well, gee, the catch basins are filled. Well, whose responsibility is that? Well, it turns out it's not the Sewage and Water Board, it's Public Works. So trying to figure out who's in charge and who should be in charge is going to be part of that.
And that's
that
an important
master plan.
thing. Of course, going through that Wednesday then led us into the weekend and tropical storm and, for the moment, Hurricane Barry. He wasn't a hurricane too terribly long. So how do we handle that? What was
in terms of the
media coverage, or just the community responding to it, and then of course the tropical storm or / hurricane is bad enough, but we had a high river, unprecedented high river.
There were a lot of things that led to some dire warnings and some huge concerns. The modeling data from all of the respected models all said that Barry was going to bring 10, 15, or 20 inches of rain to southeast Louisiana, with isolated spots getting 25 inches. The models agreed on that. The humans at the National Hurricane Center, the National Weather Service looked at it. They couldn't find any reason to dispute what the models were saying.
Right.
So they have this information. That's what the models say. So they disseminate it to state, local, and regional leaders. What are they supposed to do with that information? Well, they have to share it with the public. And there was a caveat sometimes in there that not everyone was going to see this much rain. Some areas would, some areas wouldn't. And we all know, if you've been through any number of these things, they never do exactly what the models say they're going to do. So if you want to evaluate the media coverage, did the media scare people? Well, they shared the information that the forecasters and the government shared. Could they have known that instead of 20 to 25 inches in New Orleans, we're going to get less than 2 inches?
Well,
But that's half the story. The other half is the storm surge, and I'm the guy who played Darth Schlefstein for the storm surge.
you scared us all. That's for sure.
I did. I scared everyone. I remember I got a call from Guy McGinnis in St. Bernard Parish saying, people are calling me, your story has really messed up my life here because you're saying that St. Bernard Parish is going to flood. And I said, no, what I'm saying is that we've got this really unusual situation where we do have storm surge coming in. And the concern really was, you got this high river. It was 16 feet or higher in the city, and at the gauge in New Orleans proper, the storm surge models showed that there was a chance that the water was going to get to at least 20 feet if not higher. And the irony here, of course, is that there actually is one small piece of the riverfront in New Orleans proper that has not been elevated through these different elevation projects that have gone on over the last 2 years, and it's the Army Corps of Engineers headquarters building.
Which really had people scratching their
right,
heads. How
right.
could that
well,
be?
and it's not their fault, it's Congress's fault, because Congress didn't give them the money to do that. They gave them the money to do the other 2 projects, but they never gave them the money for that until this year, and the river's been high so long that they've never been able to get out there and finish the work. So they got their HESCO baskets up and protected us from that. But the concern was still there. Well, what happens if the river gets that high or higher, if this becomes a big storm? And that's where we get back to the models. And what the models did wrong this time, what they were unable to do was figure out that we had dry air jumping over this this system, this frontal system that was still draped over the middle of the United States. And that dry air was filtering in and preventing Barry from becoming a real tropical storm. It just never became a circular storm. So you always had on the northeast quadrant, that's the quadrant of the storm that actually creates the storm surge. That portion of the storm never formed. It never had those thunderstorms.
It stayed to the south,
which kept us dry, but it also never had the storm surge for the time it took for it to move across the coast till it all finally got to west of the river. By that time, the surge threat was gone. They dropped their forecasts, and were accurate as well as they could be.
But almost no one heard about the dropped forecast, the revised forecast.
Right.
The national media, social media, everyone was still so focused on that original forecast with overtopping levees possible that was the story that would not go away.
Right, right. And like Jeff Grashels told me, he said, when we're talking about this, the thing you have to remember is, thank heavens we're not talking about what happened as a result of that storm surge coming upriver.
Yeah,
that's
we
the
really have no room for complaint, that's for sure. We all need to be very grateful, but it upsets everybody's daily lives for a couple of days, but fortunately only for a couple of days, and we all did okay with it. And one thing, I got to hand it to Dave Bernard. I watched him a lot, and he kept saying, I am not going to forecast rainfall. I'm just not going to, because they're just too many variables here. But it was pretty scary to see those 20 to 25 inch predictions, and then to see that big purple magenta blob there in the Gulf of Mexico.
And in Lafayette, Louisiana, in New Iberia, talk to them about that, because they got the crazy rainfall. And Biloxi got it, and Mobile got it.
Yep.
We just lucked out that because of that dry air and that wind aloft that was knocking the tops off of some of those storms, we just didn't get it here. And you're right, grateful's probably, but a lot of people were angry. They were angry that the forecast was wrong.
Well,
now,
not to be angry.
the one thing that we need to look out for as we move forward, and we'll have a story about this later on this weekend, is that there still is a chance that these kinds of confluences of high river and hurricane can happen in the future, and so we really need to start considering.
Is the river dropping?
Yeah.
Have they started closing the Bonnie Carré yet?
No, but they're probably going to start next week, and we'll see the river finally dropping to below 13.5 by mid-August.
Okay. The Corps had told us third week of July they were going to close the spillway. Since Barry, they had to reevaluate.
All right. Thanks a lot. Interesting discussion. All right, over to Jessica. We're going to keep it up a little bit. How did Mayor Cantrell do during all this?
It was interesting because one of the things that we've noticed about this administration is its sort of, contentious relationship with the city council. That's emerged when the administration wanted to go out for a tax, a millage, and the council basically said, we're going to put our own thing on the ballot, but when you're doing your parks thing, we're going to get out ahead of you and put a senior citizens millage on the ballot. And that was, unprecedented and something that doesn't really happen a lot. And so it was interesting and curious this week to see, to a person, pretty much almost everyone on the council say they thought that the mayor did a good job. They've not been a council that's been shy about criticizing her or getting out in front of her when they feel that it's warranted. And even the council member who serves on the Public Works Committee, Joe Giarrusso, said, she was transparent. when we sat in on briefings, you know, she seemed as though the administration had everything prepared. They had a lot of cooperation from the state, in which they had buses ready to evacuate people should that be necessary, in which they had their first responders stationed at centrally located parts of the city, should search and rescue be necessary. And a lot of folks really commended her that we spoke to this week, who said that she kept her cool. She had to make tough decisions about whether or not to evacuate or whether or not to take the threat of the rise in storm surge, you know, for what it was, as things sort of moved and looked as though it wouldn't be as severe. She ultimately decided to shelter in place. And a lot of folks gave her props for that.
And so also her communication to the public, and she had department heads and other agency heads always with her to speak about, you know, their specific areas. She seemed to handle that very well too.
She seemed to do that very well. That's not something that we haven't seen before. The Landrieu administration would do that frequently too, and also would invite other members who weren't of the council and other politicians who weren't necessarily in those briefings to come out and say whatever that they could to assure their constituents that things were going well. The difference this time was that Cantrell actually invited members of the council to sit in on the briefings, and that sort of gave them a level of comfort in her preparations that they probably didn't, I mean, they didn't have before, in terms of them having the chance to sit in on the briefings. This was the first time that happened.
And the governor,
and it gave them a window into what was going on.
The governor, how did he handle everything?
The governor, analyst that my colleague over at the Advocate Times-Picayune talked to, Tyler Bridges, said that this was a big boost for his re-election campaign, at least in the short term. You know, it was such that he was seen, you know, publicly on TV screens. You know, all of the focus and the attention was on him. Meanwhile, you know, Ralph Abraham was only gotten, I think he appeared on the Weather Channel and gave an interview, and he visited and toured some places, but the attention, he didn't quite get a lot of media coverage. And anytime, you know, these events happen, you know, it's really prime time for both mayors and governors. Every decision that they make is scrutinized, even if they appear exasperated or if they appear tired. It's, you know, even down to the narrowest detail is scrutinized. And people said they thought he did a good job. They thought he seemed very clear in command and control, and really, you know, perform well under the circumstances.
A former state legislator point out that the governor is a former military man. He went to West Point and airborne, and like when he's in this kind of role where he's the governor in kind of a quasi-military situation, you got your fatigues on and your boots, that he really was like a commander. He really was like a general in charge.
I mean, that's what people that we spoke to said that they thought about him. You know, he displayed a calmness and a sense of control that was just really refreshing for people to see.
Okay, well, we're just, you know, moving really into the height of the hurricane season. I hope we don't have any more experiences
and
the
this
chance
was
for them to
basically
do
a
that
shoo-shoo.
again.
I mean,
so.
this was nothing that, you know, they ultimately did a lot of preparation. But didn't need it.
We'll take the shoo-shoo every day. We got to move along there. But we'll take the shoo-shoo every day, I think. Errol, you wanted to talk about. I mean, tomorrow on Saturday is the 50th anniversary of the moonwalk.
By the way, the last time there was a tropical event, we used the phrase shoo-shoo, and a lot of people, to my surprise, didn't know what shoo-shoo was. But shoo-shoo, that's when it does. That's the New Orleans colloquial.
It's a firecracker that doesn't go off. Okay,
firecracker doesn't go off.
All right, but let's talk about the New Orleans connection now to the moonwalk.
Well, you know, with this being the anniversary of the first moon landing, it brings to mind a story that if you don't tell it now, you got to wait 50 more years to tell it again. And this was Michael Collins, who was the guy who stayed in the capsule. That his roots are from Algiers. His dad grew up in Algiers. His dad's name was James Lawton Collins, and Michael Collins didn't, but his dad did. But it's sort of like a pivotal New Orleans sort of moment is that James Lawton Collins' mom was related to the then mayor of New Orleans. Now, there was a change in mayors around that time, so I think it was probably Martin Berman, who would be a longtime mayor of New Orleans, and who lived in Algiers. And supposedly the story goes that James was going to Tulane, and for all we know, it could have been one of those, you know, political appointments there. And the mayor got a call from the congressman, a man named Mr. Davies. You know, congressmen have always been able to appoint people to military academies, and he was looking for a bright young man who's going to stay with the mission. And so he called the mayor, and so the mayor called his niece, who was James Lawton Collins' mom, and said, "Hey, you think James will want to go to West Point?" And so they asked James, and he agreed. So he left Tulane, and he went to West Point, and went on to have a distinguished career. He was a general. He had a brother who became a general, and then of course he had two sons. Michael wound up going to the Air Force, and another one who's in the military. But that moment, the New Orleans congressman calling the mayor, and the mayor calling his niece, and sending him to one of, I mean, that could have changed everything. I mean, had that not happened, he could have been a business major, maybe at Tulane. And so I think that was just a major influence.
Interesting. And then also a New Orleans connection, obviously, is Michoud, the workers at Michoud
Sure.
Assembly Facility, and then also Stennis. They were very, very involved in that whole Apollo program, and of course are still very involved in the space program. And you can watch for Chasing the Moon, the PBS series coming up on PBS on Channel 12, and then our show, The Crescent City Connection, talking about those folks at Michoud and Stennis. So take a look for that. Let's talk now about the sun. And,
Back to the sun, yes.
Solar plant. Solar plant's been approved by council committee. Now it has to go before council, and this is an energy plant.
This is an energy plant. The council has for quite some time pushed energy to invest more into renewable resources, solar being chief among them. And, you know, it was interesting watching the council's committee meeting this week, because the last time that Energy proposed a power plant for New Orleans East, it was an uproar. There were folks that were staged outside and had signs and picketing and everything else. This plant, not so much. The difference is that plant was a natural gas plant. This plant is a solar plant, which is really the type of technology that some of the residents in New Orleans East have been asking for, that they want to see. They're concerned about the emissions that could come from more traditional types of generation. And so Energy made this commitment initially to provide a 20 megawatt power plant, $42 million solar plant in New Orleans East. It will be on the NASA Michoud assembly facility, and is expected to be online by 2020, by the end of 2020. And this is really a part of a broader package by Energy to do about 90 megawatts of solar. Overall, it would be about 10% of Energy's total portfolio and what it uses to bring electricity to the city. And it's really something that the council is excited about and is hoping to use as part of a mandate to actually require Energy to have these renewable resources in their mix.
How much more is it going to cost the customer?
$1.50 a month.
$1.50 a month.
For the average residential customer who uses about the average amount of electricity.
And then the gas plant, the new gas plant, how much more is that going to cost the customer a month?
$6.63 a month.
And so that's why advocates of solar say,
have been using this, because one of the biggest, criticisms from, oil and gas proponents is that, these new technologies are great, but they're far ahead in the future. We can't afford this right now. Natural gas is cheap, coal's cheap, it's reliable. Let's go with what we know and not burden our people while we're working to provide them with safe and reliable power. And the advocates with the Alliance for Affordable Energy, organization that advocates for solar and other renewables, have said, see, if Energy, puts its heads together and figures out how to make this deal work for New Orleans, it can be cheaper. Solar can be cheaper.
Because at first Entergy estimated that the cost would be more in line like the $6 cost.
Would be about the same, actually. And then when the council said, no, you can do some more number crunching, you can look at an innovative way to connect the power from the grid to, from the solar plant to the grid that would cost you less. Energy committed to doing that, found some cost savings there. And there was a separate plant that they were going to lease, or they were actually going to have a third party build over in Washington Parish. And they eventually decided to lease that power in an arrangement that would be much cheaper for the citizens of New Orleans.
So are we really seeing council members now pushing Energy a little bit more than in the past, would you say?
I would say so, particularly on this issue. I mean, this is something that even as they did approve the controversial gas plant last year, the council has for quite a while been pushing Energy towards renewables, which they actually said at a committee meeting this week that they believe is the future for New Orleans.
Well, and you'll recall when there was a change in leadership for Energy New Orleans a few months back, this was there were a lot of issues, but this was one of the issues that they really felt like Charles Rice was not responding to, like he was not taking seriously the council's request to add renewable generation of power. And so I think the council has flexed its muscle on renewable energy several times now, and obviously it was important to them, and Energy had to respond.
So this plant has to now go before full council.
Yes.
It went before committee. Okay. When we talk about renewable, we have something that's sort of renewed coming our way, Errol, something that's yummy and delicious.
I'm amazed how excited people were about this. It's not that I didn't deserve the excitement, but yesterday's press release came out about the Hubig Spas return. Hubig Spas have been around for over 90 years. They were manufacturing this little plant in Marigny, and then in 2012 there was a fire, and the company just had a hard time coming back during this period of time. And at its peak, it made two kind of pies. It made the famous fried pie, which was really good, and it had kind of this glaze over it, and then the fruit that was inside. But ultimately, it's sort of like a round pie, like a smaller version of a regular pie. But anyway, it was a real staple in New Orleans for a long time. But it just had a hard time coming back. And so the announcement yesterday was a coalition of every political figure that has something to give. It came from the governor. The governor was talking about all the jobs this will create. In fact, it's going to be about 60, and about half of those will just be support jobs, but it's still jobs. It's going to be probably out in Elmwood. But Parish President Yinny was there, and the various agencies, and they have a whole series of state incentives, all to try to bring this thing back. And of course, there's not much manufacturing in this area. So all they would say is that it would be back sometime in 2020. Now, as of yesterday, as far as I understand, they still didn't even know where it was going to be. I mean, they don't have the land, and so much less the facility.
This comes off as an election year announcement from some politicians who really want to get some good news out there, because we've talked to people closer to the Hubig's family, which, by the way, was having so much trouble deciding what its future would be for so long. They're still warning quietly there are a lot of hurdles that still need to be jumped for Hubig's pies to come back. But at least there is reason for optimism at this point.
And then there's definitely, community has shown we want them back. So as a business, yeah, I think that they still, have their support platform out there.
You know what was interesting? In the last days of Hubig's before the fire, it was still this product that they'd had for 90 years, the same packaging with the same picture of the little pie man on it, same thing. But they caught on the idea as recognition of modern times. They said microwavable, right? So the very beginning they said put there.
I've never tried the microwave.
I mean, without a microwave,
like
it was
cold.
great. A microwave, it just added more to it. But
Okay.
but anyway, it may be returning.
All right, we hope that it will. What's your favorite?
What
What's your favorite?
will not be returning at some point is the baby cakes. And they may be back next season, but no longer than that. But this is like the last month to see them. Their last home game is August 29th. And so actually it may be the last chance to see professional baseball in New Orleans, because once they leave, there's still the question whether or not there'll ever be another minor league team here with all the competition you have from other pro sports. And so just as a part of the legacy of New Orleans, go try to see a baby cakes game between now and the end of August.
So, as I said before, we're planning on having a story this weekend that will do a deeper dive into the question of how high the levees are and what sort of things the federal government needs to do to take a look at that risk of storm surge coming up the river.
All right, we'll look for that. Jessica.
City Council is expected very soon to make a final decision on short-term rental regulations in the city. This is something that's been controversial, been debated quite heavily since they were legalized about 2 or 3 years ago.
All right. Dave.
The quadrennial tax assessments. If you haven't gotten your property tax bill yet from the city of New Orleans, for folks who own property in the city, get ready. There's been so much property value increase since the last time a citywide assessment was done. A lot of people are getting sticker shock now, and will find they owe the city a lot more than they did last time they were evaluated.
When do the rolls open in New Orleans?
The bills are supposed to be going out now, and then there'll be a multi-step process of reevaluating and challenging those amounts.
All right, guys, thanks a lot for being here. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.